took the book
Hey
from his
guys,
hand.
Elton here
The
again.
works of William Shakespeare.
I am here
Colored
to
brightly.
do a
My education
cartoon
has been so purely
of Quincy
scientific, he
again.
said
The only
apologetically.
reason I'm
Never
doing
read him.
Quincy again is because of my mom.
Never. He knew a little, in an irregular sort of way.
Oh, shit.
Precisely what I am told, said Cavour. I assisted him to screw in the glass cover
My
of
mom
the
did
manhole,
not
and
like
then he pressed a stud to
my
close the
watercolor
corresponding plug to
picture.
the outer case.
She didn't
The
like
little
it so
envelope of
much
twilight vanished.
that she actually
We
bought
fled
me
darkness.
this.
For a
She
time,
don't.
neither
She
of
was
us
like,
spoke.
she just
Although
wasn't
our
with it.
case would not be impervious to sound,
And she said
everything
next
was very
time she'll
still.
try to
I perceived
get
there was
me
nothing to grip when the shock of our
the
start
Premier
should come,
color
and
pencils
I
too.
realized that I should be
But yeah, she did
uncomfortable
not
for
like
blood
the
in the
watercolor
chair.
pencils. She didn't like it at
Why
all.
have we no chairs?
And
I asked. I've settled all that, said Cavour.
I'm gonna try to use my marker.
Why not?
Hopefully it'll come
You
out
will
right.
see, he said in the tone of a man who refuses to talk.
Because there's a lot of small details on this
silent.
picture. I don't know if the
Suddenly
marker
it had come
give
to be
or
clear
not.
and vivid that I was a fool to be inside that sphere. Even now, I asked myself, is it too late to
I'm
withdraw?
hitting this camera
The world
steady.
outside the sphere, I knew, would be cold
Just hitting
and
it.
hospitable enough for
But
me.
next
For
week,
weeks I have been
Thanksgiving.
living on subsidies from Cavour.
That's
But
Thanksgiving
after
next
all,
week, y'all.
would it be as cold as the infinite zero?
The
As
holidays.
inhospitable as
But yeah,
empty
she did not
space?
like the
If it had not been
watercolor.
for
She
the
said it
appearance
wasn't
of cowardice,
pigment
I
enough
believe
for
that even
her.
then
And
I should have made him let
she
me
said she
out.
just didn't like it.
But
So
I
I got this
hesitated on
picture
that
of
score,
Quincy
and
with her in
hesitated,
white. I think it's a
and grew
baseball
fretful
shirt.
and angry,
So
and the time passed.
I will
There came a little jerk,
trace them out
a noise
first.
like champagne being uncorked in another room,
I've been
and a faint whistling sound.
working
For just one instant I had a sense of enormous
every day.
tension, a transient conviction that my feet were pressing downward with a force of countless tons. It lasted for an infinitesimal time, but it stirred me to action. Cavour,
Every
I said
day.
into
I
the
had
darkness,
not been
my
having
nerves in rags. I don't
breaks.
think. I stopped. He made no answer. Confound it, I cried. I'm a fool. What business have I here? I'm not going, Cavour. The thing's too risky. I'm getting out. You can't, he said. Can't? We'll soon see about that. He made no answer for 10 seconds. It's too late for us to quarrel now, Bedford, he said. That little jerk was the start. Already we are flying as swiftly as a bullet up into the gulf of space. I said, and then it didn't seem to matter what happened. For a time, I was, as it were, stunned. I had nothing to say. It was just as if I had never heard of this idea of leaving the world before. Then I perceived an unaccountable change in my bodily sensations. It was a feeling of lightness, of unreality. Coupled with that was a queer sensation in the head, an apoplectic effect almost, and a thumping of blood vessels at the ears. Neither of these feelings diminished as time went on, but at last I got so used to them that I experienced no inconvenience. I heard it click, and the little glow lamp came into being. I saw Cavor's face.
That's how I think the point is a little bit, just a little bit too
silence.
long
The transparent blackness of the glass behind him
for my
seemed as though he
dress.
floated in a void. Well, we're committed, I said at last. Yes, he said, we're committed. Don't move, he exclaimed at some suggestion of a gesture. Let your muscles keep quite lax, as if you were in bed. We are in a little universe of our own. Look at those things. He pointed to the loose cases and bundles that had been lying on the blankets in the bottom of the sphere. I was astonished to see that they were floating now nearly a foot from the spherical wall. Then I saw from his shadow that Cavour was no longer leaning against the glass. I thrust out my hand behind me and found that I, too, was suspended in space, clear of the glass. I did not cry out nor gesticulate, but fear came upon me. It was like being held and lifted by something, you know not what. The mere touch of my hand against the glass moved me rapidly. I understood what had happened, but that did not prevent my being afraid. We were cut off from all exterior gravitation. Only the attraction of objects within our sphere had effect. Consequently, everything that was not fixed to the glass was falling.
I need to move this out of my way.
The slightness of our masses towards the center of gravity of our little world, which seemed to be somewhere about the middle of the sphere, but rather nearer to myself than Cavour on account of my greater weight. We must turn around, said Cavour, and float back to back with the things between us. It was the strangest sensation conceivable, floating thus loosely in space, at first indeed horribly strange, and when the horror passed, not disagreeable at all, exceeding restful. Indeed, the nearest thing in earthly experience to it that I know is lying on a very thick, soft featherbed. But the quality of utter detachment and independence, I had not reckoned on things like this. I had expected a violent jerk at starting, a giddy sense of speed. Instead, I felt as if I were disembodied. It was not like the beginning of a journey. It was like the beginning of a dream. End of chapter. Chapter 5 of The First Men in the Moon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The First Men in the Moon by H.G. Wells. Chapter 5, The Journey to the Moon. Presently Cavour extinguished the light. He said we had not overmuch energy stored, and that what we had we must economize for reading. For a time, whether it was long or short I do not know, there was nothing but blank darkness. A question floated up out of the void. How are we pointing? I said. What is our direction? We are flying away from the Earth at a tangent, and as the moon is near her third quarter, we are going somewhere towards her. I will open a blind. Came a click, and then a window in the outer case yawned open. The sky outside was as black as the darkness within the sphere, but the shape of the open window was marked by an infinite number of stars. Those who have only seen the starry sky from the Earth cannot imagine its appearance when the vague, half-luminous veil of our air has been withdrawn. The stars we see on Earth are the mere scattered survivors that penetrate our misty atmosphere. But now at last I could realize the meaning of the hosts of heaven. Stranger things we were presently to see, but that airless, star-dusted sky, of all things, I think that will be one of the last I shall forget. The little window vanished with a click. Another beside it snapped open and instantly closed, and then a third, and for a moment I had to close my eyes because of the blinding splendor of the waning moon. For a space I had to stare at Cavour and the white-lit things about me to season my eyes to light again, before I could turn them towards that pallid glare. 4 windows were open in order that the gravitation of the moon might act upon all the substances in our sphere.
Okay, so
I thought I was no longer floating freely in space, but that my feet were resting on the glass in the direction of the moon. The blankets and cases of provision were also creeping.
he had a chair
slowly down
behind
the
him in this
glass,
picture.
and presently
I thought
compressed
about
so as to block out a portion of the
free
view.
handing the chair out.
It seemed to me, of course, that I looked
I did
down
thought about
when
it,
I looked at the moon. On Earth,
but
down means earthward.
I think
the
what's
way
was
things
keeping me
fall,
from
and
doing
up,
so
the
is
reverse direction.
my time.
Now the pull of gravitation
And
was towards the moon.
whatever mistakes
And
you
for
make
all
on
I
this
knew
picture,
to the
don't worry about
contrary,
it, because
our Earth was overhead.
that's why they
And
say
of
practice
course,
make
when all the
perfect,
Cavalry
because
blinds
you
were
can always
closed,
go over it
down
again.
was towards the
I
center
already
of
know
our
I got to
sphere,
do it
and
over
up towards
again
its outer wall.
because my Tourette's was acting
It
crazy
was
with me.
curiously
That's
unlike
why
earthly experience too, to
I
have the
had
light
to
coming
move the
up to
camera,
one.
because
On
my arm was
Earth,
just
light falls
steadily
from
just
above or
jerking,
comes slanting down
hitting me,
sideways. But but here it
So
came from beneath our feet.
it actually
To see our
helps out a
shadows,
lot
we had to look
with
up.
my drawing.
At
Like
first, it gave
his
me a
beard
sort
right
of
here is not
vertigo
supposed to be like
stand
that.
only
His
on
beard
thick
supposed to be
glass and look
2
out upon the
lines.
moon through hundreds of thousands of miles
Yeah,
of
2
naked
lines
space. But the sickness passed very speedily.
like this.
And then the splendor of the sight.
Like that. That's how his beard supposed
The
to
reader
be.
may imagine it best
But
that he will lie on the ground some warm summer's
my
night and
Tourette's
look
kept
between
me
his
from
upraised
doing
feet
that.
at the moon. But for some reason, probably because the absence of air made it so much more luminous, the moon seemed already considerably larger than it does from Earth.
Yeah.
The minutest details of its surface were acutely
I made
clear.
several mistakes on this
And
picture.
since we did not see it through air,
Now,
its outline
the
was
shirt
bright
is
and
supposed to
sharp.
be crooked.
There was no glow or
Because
halo
in the
about
picture,
it.
the shirt was
And
crooked
the
on the picture.
stardust that covered
I had
the sky
I made a
pointed
mistake
towards
on
very
the
large
NY.
and marked the
You
outline
know,
of
it's
its
all good. It's just
unilluminated
a
part.
Tourette's, but
As I stood and stared at the moon between my feet, that perception of the impossible that had been with me off and on ever since our start
everything's still
returned
all
again
good.
with tenfold conviction. Cavour, I said, this takes me queerly. Those companies we were going to run and all that about minerals? Well,
I don't know. I think I might
don't see
try
them here.
just to make a little chair behind
No,
him.
said Cavour, but you'll get over all that.
A little chair.
I suppose I'm made to turn right side up again. Still, this. For a moment I could half believe there never was a world. That
I don't know.
copy
Should I
of
use my
Lloyd's
marker
News
to
might help
fill
you.
it in
I stared
or
at the
not?
paper
I
for a
really
moment,
don't know.
then held it above the level of my face, and found I could read it quite easily. I struck a column of mean little advertisements. A gentleman of private means is willing to lend money, I read. I knew that gentleman. Then somebody eccentric wanted to sell a cutaway bicycle, quite new and cost £15 for £5. And a lady in distress wished to dispose of some fish knives and forks, a wedding present at a great sacrifice. No doubt some simple soul was sagely examining these knives and forks, and another triumphantly riding off on that bicycle, and a third trustfully consulting that benevolent gentleman of means even as I read. I laughed and let the paper drift from my hand. Are we visible from the earth? I asked. Why? I knew someone who was rather interested in astronomy. It occurred to me that it would be rather odd if my friend chanced to be looking through some telescope. It would need the most powerful telescope on Earth even now to see us as the minutest speck. For a time, I stared in silence at the moon. It's a world, I said. One feels that infinitely more than one ever did on Earth. People, perhaps. People, he exclaimed. No, banish all that. Think yourself a sort of ultra-arctic voyager, exploring the desolate places of space. Look at it. He waved his hand at the shining whiteness below. It's dead. Dead. Vast extinct volcanoes, lava wildernesses, tumbled wastes of snow, or frozen carbonic acid.
And the good thing about these pencils is I can read the
Everywhere
name a
land
little.
seams and cracks
Just
and
a little,
gulfs.
not a lot.
Nothing happens. Men
A
have
little,
watched
not a
this
lot.
planet systematically with telescopes for over 200 years. How much change do you think they have seen? None. They have traced 2 indisputable landslips, a doubtful crack, and one slight periodic change
I'm
of
gonna
color.
get my Premiere
and
Color
that's
Black
all.
on here.
I didn't know
On this
they
right
traced
here.
even that. Oh yes, but as for people...
Then again, I might just leave it
By
right
the
there.
way,
I don't know.
I asked, how small a thing will the biggest telescopes show upon the moon? One could see a fair-sized church. One could certainly see any towns or buildings, or anything like the handiwork of men. There might perhaps be insects, something in the way of ants, for example, so that they could hide in deep burrows from the lunar light, or some new sort of creatures having no earthly parallel. That is the most probable thing if we are to find life there at all. Think of the difference in conditions. Life must fit itself to a day as long as 14 earthly days, a cloudless sun blaze of 14 days, and then a night of equal length, growing ever colder and colder under these cold, sharp stars. In that night there must be cold, the ultimate cold, absolute zero, 273 degrees centigrade below the earthly freezing point. Whatever life there is must hibernate through that and rise again each day. He mused. One can imagine something worm-like, he said, taking its air solid as an earthworm swallows earth, or thick-skinned monsters. By the by, I said, why didn't we bring a gun? He did not answer that question. No, he concluded, we just have to go. We shall see when we get there.
Now let's just work on Quincy. Okay, so I want to use white.
Of course, there's my minerals anyhow, I said, whatever the conditions may be.
White.
Presently, he told me he wished to alter our course a little by letting the earth tug at us for a moment.
You're going to use yellow.
He was going to open one earthworm blind for 30 seconds. He warned me that it would make my head swim and advised me to extend my hands against the glass to make my fall.
Look.
I did.
It says sunflower.
And thrust my feet against the bales of
I might use the sunflower. I don't know.
To prevent their falling upon me. Then, with a click, the window flew open. I fell clumsily upon hands and face, and saw for a moment between my black extended fingers our Mother Earth, a planet in a downward sky. We were still very near. Cavour told me the distance was perhaps 800 miles, and the huge terrestrial disk filled all heaven. But already it was plain to see that the world was a globe. The land below us was in twilight and vague, but westward the vast gray stretches of the Atlantic shone like molten silver under the receding day. I think I recognized the cloud-dimmed coastlines of France and Spain and the south of England, and then, with a click, the shutter closed again, and I found myself in a state of extraordinary confusion, sliding slowly over the smooth glass. When at last things settled themselves in my mind again, it seemed quite beyond question that the moon was down and under my feet, and that the earth was somewhere away on the level of the horizon, the earth that had been down to me and my kindred since the beginning of things. So slight were the exertions required of us, so easy did the practical annihilation of our weight make all we had to do, that the necessity for taking refreshment did not occur to us for nearly 6 hours by Cavour's chronometer after our start. I was amazed at that lapse of time. Even then I was satisfied with very little. Cavour examined the apparatus for absorbing carbonic acid and water, and pronounced it to be in satisfactory order, our consumption of oxygen having been extraordinarily slight, and our talk being exhausted for the time, and there being nothing further for us to do. We gave way to a curious drowsiness that had come upon us, and spreading our blankets on the bottom of the sphere in such a manner as to shut out most of the moonlight, wished each other good night, and almost immediately fell asleep. And so, sleeping, and sometimes talking and reading a little, and at times eating, although without any keenness of appetite, but for the most part in a sort of quiescence that was neither waking nor slumber, we fell through a space of time that had neither night nor day in it, silently, softly, and swiftly down towards.
So let's go and cut his skin.
It is a curious thing that while we were in the sphere, we felt not the slightest desire for food, nor did we feel the want of it when we abstained. At first we forced our appetites, but afterwards we fasted completely. Altogether, we did not consume 1/100th part of the compressed provisions.
Okay, so I'm using yellow first.
The amount of carbonic acid we breathed was also unnaturally low, but why this was, I am quite unable to explain. End of footnote. End of chapter. Chapter Chapter 6 of The First Men in the Moon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The First Man in the Moon by H.G. Wells. Chapter 6, The Landing on the Moon. I remember how one day Cavour suddenly opened 6 of our shutters and blinded me so that I cried aloud at him. The whole area was moon, a stupendous scimitar of white dawn with its edge hacked out by notches of darkness, the crescent shore of an ebbing tide of darkness, out of which peaks and pinnacles came glittering into the blaze of the sun. I take it the reader has seen pictures or photographs of the moon, and that I need not describe the broader features of that landscape, those spacious ring-like ranges, vaster than any terrestrial mountains, their summits shining in the day, their shadows harsh and deep.
I think it's orange
plains,
and go over
ridges,
his skin a little bit
hills,
with this orange.
craterlets, all passing at last from a blazing illumination into a common mystery of black. Athwart this world we were flying scarcely 100 miles above its crests and pinnacles, and now we could see what no eye on earth will ever see, that under the blaze of the day, the harsh outlines of the rocks and ravines of the plains and crater floor grew gray and indistinct under a thickening haze, that the white of their lit surfaces broke into lumps and patches, and broke again, and shrank and vanished, and that here and there strange tints of brown and olive grew and spread.
Don't do it
What
all
little
way.
time
Don't
we
worry
had
about it.
for
Okay.
watching then, for now we had
And
come to the real danger of the journey. We had to drop ever closer
let me
to the
get
moon
this
as we
pocket
spun
right
about
here.
it, to slacken our pace and watch our chance, until at last we could dare to drop upon its surface. For Cavour, that was a
Like
time of
toasted.
intense exertion. For me, it was an anxious inactivity.
And I'm just gonna go
I
over some
seemed to perpetually to be getting
certain
out of his
parts on
way.
here.
He leaped about the sphere from point to point with an agility that would have been impossible on Earth. He was perpetually opening and closing the Cavorite windows, making calculations, consulting his chronometer by means of the glow lamp during those last eventful hours. For a long time we had all our windows closed and hung silently in darkness, hurling through space. Then he was feeling for the shutter studs, and suddenly 4 windows were open. I staggered and covered my eyes, drenched and scorched and blinded by the unaccustomed splendor of the sun beneath my feet. Then again the shutters snapped, leaving my brain spinning in a darkness that pressed against the eyes. And after that I floated in another vast black silence. Then Cavour switched on the electric light and told me he proposed to bind all our luggage together with the blankets about it against the concussion of our descent. We did this with our windows closed because in that way our goods arranged themselves naturally at the center of the sphere. That, too, was a strange business. We 2 men floating loose in that spherical space and packing and pulling ropes. Imagine it if you can. No up nor down, and every effort resulting in unexpected movements. Now I would be pressed against the glass with the full force of Cavour's thrust. Now I would be kicking helplessly in a void. Now the star of the electric light would be overhead, now underfoot. Now Cavour's feet would float up before my eyes, and now we would be crossways to each other. But at last our goods were safely bound together in a big soft bale, all except 2 blankets with head holes that we were to wrap about ourselves. Then for a flash Cavour opened a window moonward, and we saw that we were dropping towards a huge central crater with a number of minor
I'm gonna get
craters
this
grouped in a
Premier
sort of
color
cross about it.
and
then
go
again
to certain
Cavour
parts
flung
of
our
his
little
head
sphere open to the scorching,
and his
blinding sun.
face.
I think he was using the sun's attraction as a brake. "Cover yourself with a blanket," he cried, thrusting himself from me, and for a moment I did not understand. Then I hauled the blanket from beneath my feet and got it about me and over my head and eyes. Abruptly, he closed the shutters again, snapped one open again, and closed it. Then suddenly began snapping them all open, each safely into its steel roller. There came a jar, and then we were rolling over and over, bumping against the glass and against the big bale of our luggage, and clutching at each other. And outside, some white substance splashed as if we were rolling down a slope of snow.
I'm gonna get my toasted again. It's the toasted, right? Yeah.
Over came a thud, and I was half buried under the bale of our possessions, and for a space, everything was still. Then I could hear Cavour puffing and grunting, and the snapping of a shutter in its sash. I made an effort, thrust back our blanket-wrapped luggage, and emerged from beneath it. Our open windows were just visible as a deeper black set with stars. We were still alive, and we were lying in the darkness of the shadow of the wall of the great crater into which we had fallen. We sat getting our breath again, and feeling the bruises on our limbs. I don't think either of us had had a very clear expectation of such rough handling as we had received. I struggled painfully to my feet.
Now I'm
And now
my
could I, to look at the landscape.
crazy all white.
But
Let me see.
it's tremendously
Is
dark.
this one
Cavour.
will work the same
glass
like my
was
other
dewy,
one?
and as I spoke, I wiped at it with my blanket. We're half an hour or so beyond the day, he said. We must wait. It was impossible to distinguish anything. We might have been in a sphere of steel for all that we could see. My rubbing with the blanket simply smeared the glass, and as fast as I wiped it, it became opaque again with freshly condensed moisture mixed with an increasing quantity of blanket hairs. Of course, I ought not to have used the blanket. In my efforts to clear the glass, I slipped upon the damp surface and hurt my shin against one of the oxygen cylinders that protruded from our bale.
Man,
The thing was exasperating. It was absurd.
I forget how hard
We
it
were
is to
just
shave.
arrived upon the
I forget
moon,
after one day.
amidst we knew not what wonders. All we could see was the gray and streaming wall of the bubble at which we had come. Confound it, I said, but at this rate we might have stopped at home. And I squatted on the bale and shivered and drew my blanket closer about me. Abruptly the moisture turned to spangles and fronds of frost. Can you reach the electric heater? Said Cavour. Yes, that black knob, or we shall freeze. I did not wait to be told twice. And now, said I, what are we to do? Wait, he said.
So I'm getting my
Wait.
toasted again.
Of course. We shall have to wait until our air gets warm again, and then this glass will clear. We can't do anything till then. It's night here yet. We must wait for the day to overtake us. Meanwhile, don't you feel hungry? For a space I did not answer him, but sat fretting. I turned reluctantly from the smeared puzzle of the glass and stared at his face. Yes, I said, I am hungry. I feel somehow enormously disappointed. I had expected... I don't know what I had expected, but not this. I summoned my philosophy and, rearranging my blanket about me, sat down on the bale again and began my first meal on the moon. I don't think I finished it. I forget. Presently, first in patches, then running rapidly together into wider spaces, came the clearing of the glass, came the drawing of the misty veil that hid the moon world from our eyes. We peered out upon the landscape of the moon. End of chapter. Chapter 7 of The First Men in the Moon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina.
I'm gonna fill in his list.
The First Men in the Moon by H.G. Wells. Chapter 7. Sunrise on the Moon. As we saw it first, it was the wildest and most desolate of scenes. We were in an enormous amphitheater, a vast circular plain, the floor of the giant crater. Its cliff-like walls closed us in on every side. From the westward, the light of the unseen sun fell upon them, reaching to the very foot of the cliff, and showed a disordered escarpment of drab and grayish rock, lined here and there with banks and crevices of snow. This was perhaps a dozen miles away, but at first no intervening atmosphere diminished in the slightest the minutely detailed brilliancy with which these things glared at us. They stood out clear and dazzling against a background of starry blackness that seemed to our earthly eyes rather a gloriously spangled velvet curtain than the spaciousness of the sky. The eastward cliff was at first merely a starless selvage to the starry dome. No rosy flush, no creeping pallor announced the commencing day. Only the corona, the zodiacal light, a huge cone-shaped luminous haze pointing up towards the splendor of the morning star, warned us of the imminent nearness of the sun. Whatever light was about us was reflected by the westward cliffs. It showed a huge undulating plain, cold and gray, a gray that deepened eastward into the absolute raven darkness of the cliff shadow. Innumerable rounded gray summits, ghostly hummocks, billows of snowy substance, stretching crest beyond crest into the remote obscurity, gave us our first inkling of the distance of the crater wall. These hummocks looked like snow. At the time, I thought they were snow, but they were not. They were mounds and masses of frozen
I'm using the Premier Color White
so it was
again.
at first, and then, sudden, swift, and amazing, came the lunar day. The sunlight had crept down the cliff. It touched the drifted masses at its base and incontinently came striding with 7-leagued boots towards us. The distant cliff seemed to shift and quiver, and at the touch of the dawn, a reek of gray vapor poured upward from the crater floor.
It's getting on my nerves.
And puffs and drifting wraiths of gray,
angry.
thicker and broader and denser, until at last the whole westward plain was steaming like a wet handkerchief held before the fire, and the westward cliffs were no more than refracted glare beyond. "It is air," said Cavour. "It must be air, or it would not rise like this, at the mere touch of a sunbeam, and at this pace." He peered upwards. "Look," he said. "What?" I asked. "In the sky, already on the blackness, a little touch of blue. See? The stars seem larger, and the little ones and all those dim nebulosities we saw in empty space, they are hidden." Swiftly, steadily, the day approached us. Gray summit after gray summit was overtaken by the blaze and turned to a smoking white intensity. At last there was nothing to the west of us but a bank of surging fog, the tumultuous advance and descent of cloudy haze. The distant cliff had receded farther and farther, had loomed and changed through the world, and foundered and vanished at last in its confusion. Nearer came that steaming advance, nearer and nearer, coming as fast as the shadow of a cloud before the southwest wind. About us rose a thin anticipatory haze. Cavour gripped my arm. "What?" I said. "Look, the sunrise, the sun." He turned me about and pointed to the brow of the eastward cliff, looming above the haze about us, scarce lighter than the darkness of the sky. But now its line was marked by strange reddish shapes, tongues of vermilion flame that writhed and danced. I fancied it must be spirals of vapor that had caught the light and made this crest of fiery tongues against the sky, but indeed it was the solar prominences I saw, a crown of fire about the sun that is forever hidden from earthly eyes by our atmospheric veil. And then, the sun. Steadily, inevitably came a brilliant line.
I'm gonna go over it with this sunflower to see how it would do with this sunflower. I ain't never used sunflower before.
And hurled a shaft of heat at us as though it was a spear. It seemed verily to
They
stab
never
my
used
eyes.
sunflower,
I
so
cried
that's something
aloud and
different for
turned
me.
about blinded, groping for my blanket beneath the veil.
I usually
And
get
with that incandescence came
particular
a sound,
pack.
the first sound that had reached us from without since we left the earth, a hissing and rustling, the stormy trailing of the aerial garment of the advancing day. And with the coming of the sound and the light, the sphere lurched, and blinded and dazzled we staggered helplessly against each other. It lurched again, and the hissing grew louder. I had shut my doors. I was making clumsy efforts to cover my head with my blanket, and this second lurch sent me helplessly off my feet. I fell against the veil, and opening my eyes had a momentary glimpse of the air just outside our glass. It was running. It was boiling, like snow into which a white-hot rod is thrust. What had been solid air had suddenly, at the touch of the sun, become a paste, a mud, a slushy liquefaction that hissed and bubbled into gas. There came a still more violent whirl of the sphere, and we had clutched one another. In another moment we were spun about again. Round we went and over, and then I was on all fours. The lunar dawn had hold of us. It meant to show us little men what the moon could do with us. I caught a second glimpse of things without. Puffs of vapor, half-liquid slush, excavated, sliding, falling, sliding. We dropped into darkness. I went down with Cavor's knees in my chest. Then he seemed to fly away from me, and for a moment I lay with all the breath out of my body, staring upward. The toppling crag of the melting stuff had splashed over us, buried us, and now it thinned and boiled off us. I saw the bubbles dancing on the glass above. I heard Cavor
I'm gonna go
exclaiming
over his hair
feebly.
again with the black.
Then some huge landslip in the thawing air had caught us, and spluttering expostulation, we began to roll down a slope, rolling faster and faster, leaping crevasses and rebounding from
He got little
banks,
braids right
faster
here. It
and
doesn't show on the
faster,
video,
westward,
but it shows
the
right here
white-hot
that he
boiling
got little
tumult
braids in
of
his
the
hair.
lunar day.
And plus the room's pretty dark. The room's dark, so.
Darkroom songs include Drink Me, Hard for Me, Watch Me Burn,
Okay.
and others.
Go back to my audiobook.
Clutching at one another, we spun about, pitched this way and that. Our bale of packages leaping at us, pounding at us. We collided, we gripped, we were torn asunder. Our heads met, and the whole universe burst into fiery darts and stars. On the earth we should have smashed one another a dozen times. But on the moon, luckily for us, our weight was only 1/6 of what it is terrestrially, and we fell very mercifully.
See something.
I recall a sensation of utter sickness, a feeling as if my brain were upside down inside my skull, and then something was at work upon my face. Some thin feelers worried my ears. Then I discovered the brilliance of the landscape around was mitigated by blue spectacles. Cavor bent over me, and I saw his face upside down, his eyes also protected by tinted goggles. His breath came irregularly, and his lip was bleeding from a bruise. "Better?" he said, wiping the blood with the back of his hand. Everything seemed swaying for a space, but that was simply my giddiness. I perceived that he had closed some of the shutters in the outer sphere to save me from the direct blaze of the sun. I was aware that everything about us was very brilliant. "Lord," I gasped, "but this..." I craned my neck to see. I perceived there was a blinding glare outside, an utter change from the gloomy darkness of our first impressions. "Have I been insensible long?" I asked. "I don't know. The chronometer's broken. Some little time. My dear chap, I have been afraid." I lay for a space, taking this in. I saw his face still bore evidences of emotion. For a while I said nothing. I passed an inquisitive hand over my contusions and surveyed
He got
his
an
face
earring,
for similar
coloring
damages.
his earring
The
blue.
back of my right hand had suffered most
Um,
and was skinless and raw. My
You can't
forehead
really
was
see
bruised
it
and
on this
bled.
camera. It's pretty
He
dark.
handed me a little
I
measure
don't know.
with
I
some
think I
of the
need to do something about the
restorative,
lights in this
I
room,
forget
but
the name of it, he had brought with
this
us.
is what I
After a
did,
time, I
Quincy.
felt a little better. I began to stretch my
And
limbs carefully. Soon I could talk.
I feel pretty good about it,
It
actually.
wouldn't have done, I said, as though there had been no interval. No, it wouldn't, he thought, his hands hanging over his knees. He peered through the glass and then stared at me. Good Lord, he said. No! What has happened? I asked after a pause. Have we jumped to the tropics?
Well, this is all
It
gonna
was
do
as
for
I
now because it's
expected.
getting late. But this is
His
my
hair seemed
cartoon
decorated.
I did
His
Quincy.
hair, at any rate,
And
has
I'm gonna do
pepper in
another
it, and the
picture of
surface of the
Quincy,
moon is showing.
but not too
We're lying
soon.
on a
I'm
bank
ready
of
to
earthy
do
rock.
somebody
Here and there,
else.
bare soil is
And this
exposed.
other person that I
But we are
wanted
sort
to
of
do
soiled. It
is,
occurred to him that it was unnecessary
can you
to
make it
explain.
out?
He assisted
Can
me
you make
into a
it
sitting
out who
position,
it
and I
is?
could see with my own eyes. End of chapter.
But yeah, I don't know. I feel like I need to shade him some more, but I'm just gonna go and just leave it alone.